Welcome to our module on building and sustaining relationships with legislators in trauma-informed advocacy. In this module, we will discuss asking for and preparing for a meeting with policymakers, along with sharing some considerations for those meetings with policymakers. And we'll also talk a bit about identifying and developing legislative champions. And it's our best hope that you will emerge from this module feeling like you are confident and competent in how to utilize your skills to hold effective meetings that will help you build a sustained relationship with key legislators, because we know from our experience that working closely with legislators leads to better policy and more impactful outcomes. And the resources and levers of government that legislators have access to can be really critical in the effective implementation of policy at scale as well. So let's dive in. So to start, to get a meeting, you have to ask for a meeting, right? And many, if not most legislators have a really easy form on their website that you can fill out to request a meeting, or at the very least, they offer an email address that you can reach out to get to the person in charge of scheduling appointments. And on this slide, you see that there are some details that are outlined here that are helpful to give up front. And I really want to uplift that when you reach out, be sure to identify yourself as a constituent if you are one, because Congress people rely on you, constituents, to inform them about what's happening in the community. Constituent needs and opinions are consistently identified as the most influential factor in determining policy priorities among legislators. And constituents can really be perceived as highly reliable sources of research and information. You know, they're the experts of their communities. And so if you aren't a constituent, it's important to demonstrate to policymakers that, as an advocate, you are representing many constituencies, institutions, and voters in that legislators' communities. So announce also that if you're representing a particular organization or group, and really appeal to the legislator in terms of connecting that to how this is relevant to them and their constituency. Being aware also of when your legislator is here in Washington, D.C. or in their home state or district, as well as what legislation they're considering and drafting, those are also some helpful pieces of information to determine when is the ideal time to meet with your legislator. And you can check the congressional calendar for when the House and Senate are in session in Washington, D.C. During recesses, you can generally plan on your legislators being in their home offices. So timing does matter a little bit here. And some think that they have to meet specifically with their legislator in person to make a difference. However, we know that meeting with staff can be just as effective or even more so, because staffers have considerable influence. They're trusted, reliable sources of relevant information, and they essentially serve as the eyes and the ears for their legislators. And if there is a constituent with a particular expertise that may help them with a policy issue, they usually know that, and they may actually be the ones to call on you for that ongoing assistance. And those relationships, we've found at CTIP, those really matter. And you'll also get more time to make your case with staff, by the way, than you ever would with your legislator, right? So if you can convince staffers that you speak with that the issue is important and the policy solution that you're proposing is in their wheelhouse and makes sense for them, you are more likely to score a meeting with an elected official themselves eventually too. And furthermore, staff may be able to make some decisions about what a legislator might support. You might not be able to ask for a commitment on the spot, but you're going to get a really good idea of whether or not you're on the right track in terms of how you're presenting the issue based on what this legislator values and believes. So with staff, be excited, be respectful, and be convincing. In terms of preparing for a meeting, be sure you've done your homework. There is more about gathering and conveying key information in other modules, and there are just some sort of high-level considerations on this slide. And I want to uplift that many advocates find it tremendously useful to plot things out in advance before having a meeting, because it really helps to be sure that they're prepared with the right information needed to stay focused on their advocacy goals for that meeting, which might range from educating a congressperson about a particular issue to directly asking them to co-sponsor a piece of legislation. And similarly, going in with a group can help you navigate the discussion and really strengthen your message. And if you're bringing multiple people to the meeting, I do want to mention that it's important to let the office know everyone who will be coming up front, because that can be a real asset, especially if you're newer to advocacy and belong to a group. You might not be the one organizing the meeting, and you might like to attend to sort of shadow people who maybe are more experienced your first time. So there are so many folks who are really willing to bring you along and model what is great trauma-informed advocacy practice. And you may even be able to use your connections with a group to practice some role play with more experienced and seasoned advocates to prepare, though it's important to realize that you don't need to be an expert on everything. You being in the room brings value. You have expertise on your own areas, and that will be valuable to any conversation that you have with a legislator. Remember that due to limited time and resources, policymakers can't really address all problems at once, right? And so they may be a little sidetracked, sometimes maybe with an emergency like a pandemic or civil unrest, right? So they need to determine really what is worth their time and attention as well as what isn't. And so it's important to recognize that your policy priorities, they're going to be competing with economic, political, social welfare, healthcare, and defense needs that are all swirling around, begging to be heard. And so if there's something happening, see if you can tie your policy vision into that. That might be an inroad to getting your issue seen earlier, even if there are other things swirling about. So for instance, CTIP had to pivot to lifting up the notion that the pandemic is a collective trauma and advocate for a trauma-informed response within relief bills. And some of our language was considered in those bills. And while, of course, we couldn't get all of our policy goals in at such an urgent time, and it might not have been where our priorities would have lied prior to the pandemic and the racial reckoning and all of the unfolding of mental and behavioral health issues that have been cascading through our society since, we were able to share really valuable information that was very timely. And we ultimately believe that we were able to impact the policy response to a crisis situation. And so, if this proves to be worthwhile, we can reach back out to how we influenced good outcomes that came about as a result and continue to find those moments that we can meet with advocacy around advancing resiliency and healing-centered approaches and trauma-informed practice. And in addition, most legislators must make decisions about any particular proposed bill based on pretty limited information, really, because you can only share so much in a short period of time at these meetings. And we talk about making sure you're conveying especially complex information and communicating in a clear and concise way effectively in another module that you can refer to. So just at a high level here, I want to uplift that it can often make sense to capture key information on a 1 or 2 page item to leave behind with your legislator on an issue or solution. So for instance, after a first meeting, you might leave behind an infographic or I suppose, a fact sheet that's visually evocative and memorable while also being digestible and persuasive at a very quick glance. On the corner of the desk, oh yeah, I was thinking about that. That's a pretty compelling statistic. Keeping that issue front of mind, even when you've left the office, is really important. It's also really critical to determine what your ask is going to be. And this is essentially, right, the purpose of your visit, and this ought to be framed as a call to action in our experience. And that can be anything, again, from requesting that a member of a Congress vote a particular way on a bill to simply letting the office know that, I am an expert on this topic of interest to your district, and I would be so happy to be a resource at future meetings after you've reviewed this information when you're ready to take action. And when preparing your ask, consider too how you might be able to make it really clear and concise so they know what you're asking for, not sort of mired in details and a lot of language that isn't as straightforward as they might be able to retain given all they have swirling around their heads with all of the different issues they're paying attention to. And also, of course, again, discussing the relevance to your legislator's district is an important piece of this puzzle as well. Now, it can also be helpful if you think about the issue from a legislator's perspective and come really prepared with some answers for what you think might be possible questions based on what you know they value, care about, and demonstrate interest in and action on. And, they may be curious about the merits of an issue, which essentially means absent of any emotional or technical bias. What are the objective facts? What is the cost? Does the issue have the commitment of an interest group, which certainly can either be in your favor or not so much, depending on the topic in the interest group and the legislator before you? What is the general sentiment about this issue? Who already supports this ask? And, really taking the time to highlight stakeholders who they're most similar to if there's already someone else on board. And also who might be opposed to the ask and why they might be opposed to the ask can be a helpful question to explore for yourself to prepare for advocacy work. And also sort of preparing a response of, okay, cool that they think that. Now, why are they incorrect? Why isn't that a fit? Why is our solution still the right one? And so just thinking about these sorts of considerations, even if you don't have perfect answers, is so helpful in preparing. And it will likely make you more deft in navigating the conversations in your meeting, even though you certainly cannot anticipate everything that would possibly come up. So legislators and their staff are incredibly busy, and it's important to know going in that they may need some flexibility when scheduling your meeting. And your meeting could end up taking place in an office, in a hallway for a walk and talk, or going into their next meeting as they're on their way in the hall. So it's always good to be prepared for the unexpected. And we offer some tips on this slide to help you ensure that your meeting runs smoothly, pretty much no matter where it ends up happening, when it ends up happening, for how long it ends up happening. Things like being concise and respectful of your legislator's time, just some really key considerations here. And a great way to start in general, even if you don't agree with your legislator on much of anything, by the way, when you're at the meeting, is to start by thanking them for something they did recently that aligns with your advocacy work. And once you get past all of those sort of cordial formalities of meeting, this is where you get to tell your story. And we have a module on storytelling available to help you think about this, because telling stories really has been demonstrated to increase the impact of your advocacy efforts than if you were just using data, right? And so listening carefully and actively and taking clues from the people with whom you are engaging and listening to can increase the quality of your conversation and potentially deepen your relationship with your legislator and their staff as well. Upholding honesty and transparency is perhaps the most critical part of this slide. Really want to lift that up. Essentially, don't lie if you don't know, because just like with anyone, trust is critical and it's built over time. And since trust is key, be sure you're presenting your evidence, accurately using facts, and that if you don't know something, you say so, and that you just commit to finding out and following up, which in fact, if I'm being honest here, not knowing in the moment can sometimes be a gift, because it gives you an excuse to continue the dialogue, right? And being able to consistently provide useful information, to be an inroad, to be constantly, here, I'd like to share this with you, or I'd like to follow up with you on this, to your legislator and their staff, staff, that can only be an asset to you, as long as you're certainly not, spamming them all of the time, every single time something even more minute comes out. And as you build that relationship and that trust, with that trust comes more credibility and salience for the policymaker when it comes to your proposed policy solution. So all of that interaction, that trust, it really works in your favor to be upfront and honest about all sides of the issue and advocating for your solution in that context. And once you've told your story, you get to make your ask, right? And so it's best when this is a specific action that you're asking them to take. So to share with their two colleagues who chair a committee they're on this information, or potentially to file a bill integrating your policy solution. Those are really concrete asks. And if your legislator says, yes, I'm willing to file a bill, first of all, that's fantastic. Congratulations. And second of all, ask how you can help. Do you need to reach out to other legislators to ask them to co-sponsor? Does the legislator need additional data to file the bill that you can help with? And just really continuing to stay engaged and presenting yourself or your group of advocates as that go-to resource when it comes to this policy solution, that gives you a lot of power. And once you're back from your meeting, debriefing with your group of advocates is really useful. And if you don't have a group, debriefing with yourself is important too. And that means acknowledging what went well, discussing lessons learned, going over the details and any action items that might remain, like did you promise any follow-up that you need to provide? And please do remember to demonstrate gratitude in person and also in this follow-up time. That's a big piece of this. In the short term, you can send a thank you email to the staffer shortly following the meeting, and you can be sure to respond to any questions that you couldn't answer in the meeting and provide any follow-up information you promised. And really being thankful for their time and consideration throughout all of this is huge. It's a really easy way to keep your issue on their mind, and again, just front of their face, just something that is continually they're seeing pop up. And it's also just being polite and professional to show gratitude and thanking them for their time and consideration as well. So there's a dual purpose there. And, legislators and their staff are unfathomably busy. So the fact that they've taken the time to hear you out, whether you secured their support for your policy yet or not, it's just so important to thank them for taking that time and using that opportunity again to reiterate your ask, to remind them of your undoubtedly, chef's kiss, convincing conversation. And it can also be helpful to set a reminder on your calendar to check in with the congressional office every few months. If it's something where you've sort of let the issue lie, they're seeking maybe more information, giving them more time to learn. It's important to follow up and keep that line of communication open. So if you notice, say, a piece of legislation, or there's a current event that concerns you or strikes you in some way, that's when you can call or write the office and let them know. And if you have a reminder in your calendar, you can keep those lines of communication fresh and continue to build trust and form that relationship with your legislator and their staff. At this point, after going through the meeting with your legislator, that whole process is something to really take the time to reflect on. And, what are you noticing and thinking about is something to really take the time and take a step back and say, what's the first thought on how you could capture your issue in a concise, digestible way the next time you advocate to that person. And sitting here now with this advocacy module, I'd encourage you to reflect what you might be able to do as a first step if you haven't had meetings yet. What's a way that you can convey this information based on what you already know about your target audience to be effective in building relationships? And additionally, seeking your past expertise, what have you found useful in the past that has worked to help someone without maybe any background or expertise in this area still acquire enough of a comprehension of the issue to take informed action? I bet you've done that in the past, so calling to those skills here can be an asset as well. So once you've built relationships with your legislators and have done your research on the general policy landscape around your issue, you may be wise to consider who your champions are. And these may include legislators who are likely to file, enthusiastically sponsor, or champion legislation that's aligned with your policy goals based on actions they've already taken or things that they already speak to frequently, or based on conversations where you felt like they were really engaged and interested and wanted to carry forward this work in their roles. You may also, by the way, possibly be able to look to members of relevant committees or to high-profile legislators who are in the public eye or are well-respected or tenured and thus have built up a lot of relationships among key policymakers. You can think big here. It doesn't necessarily, especially if you're in a group rather than yourself advocating as an individual to your legislator, it doesn't have to just be one person. There might be more people to target depending on the story that you're telling and the goals that you have in your advocacy agenda. Another consideration is that newer members, especially freshmen, are more likely to introduce a new bill because, they're looking for ideas, they're looking to make their mark, and also the leadership of the Senate and the House are looking to give newer members some wins, so to speak. They want them to be successful as they enter their roles. So be sure that you don't overlook the newbies as well. And remember that people can assume leadership positions over time. And so someone who supports you now and starts out as, maybe a new member or someone who isn't quite as established, they can work their way up to being a committee chair and ultimately have considerable influence. So we would really invite you to just strive to keep any allies you have, build on those relationships, and believe firmly that all of these relationships matter in advancing the vision that we all hope to achieve. In addition to looking at more formal legislative profiles of potential champions, paying attention to social media is another great way to discover who maybe is a champion or could be a champion, even if they haven't put forth legislation yet, even if they might not come to mind as someone who talks about this issue frequently. Elected officials do often take to social media to make comment to and otherwise uplift topics they care about that might not make it to the news cycle or might not make it to something that you might notice if you're looking at the updates about these types of legislation and policy initiatives. So you may be able to identify possible champions just by investigating their social media. You might be able to be privy to some of the community or state needs in their district, and you might see that your policy agenda presents a solution to what's impacting their constituents when you take a look. So, that is another opportunity that sometimes gets missed. Just want to uplift that. There certainly are other places to look. And so once you have identified your champions, you're going to want to consider how you can best leverage their allyship. And this slide has some considerations related to building momentum by engaging the champions you've built relationships with in order to advance your policy agenda. It's often true in our experience that your champions will also have access to valuable networks that you probably don't have much of a connection to or as much of a connection to. They also will have access to specialized knowledge related to what's trending and what's being prioritized among policymakers at any given time that, again, the public just might not be privy to, and that's powerful. And mapping relationships while recruiting your champions can help inform engagement strategies on how to leverage those connections. And in this vein, it can be helpful to really pay attention to who your potential champions most frequently work and sponsor legislation with, especially when it comes to bipartisan sponsor bills. So you can really leverage, again, those existing strong connections and partnerships to extend the reach of your advocacy agenda. Champions can also serve as messengers of what you feel other policymakers really need to know, and that can happen by way of drafting legislation, for one. And so in legislative language that aligns with CTIP's initiatives, for example, We often see definitions for things like trauma-informed care and positive and adverse childhood experiences, or PACEs, and similar key terms in legislation. And even if the specific piece of legislation using, defining, and suggesting the implementation of these terms doesn't necessarily make its way onto the governor's or president's desk this legislative session, there is notable progress made even by introducing these concepts in legislative language in bills that are already existing or in new measures that you are championing be made. And once decision makers really become aware of and curious about the science and the evidence, we believe that it increases the success of activating advocate networks to educate and deepen the relationship with their representatives and encourage support for measures that advance those trauma-informed, resilience-building, and healing-centered approaches to public policy, right? Knowledge is power. Building on that foundation is key, and that foundation existing in the first place is contingent upon even just people being introduced to this language in some way or another. So that's really valuable progress as well. In the second box on the slide, you'll notice that the list identifies some ways that champions can elevate your message to have a substantial impact, including speaking out at events, to their colleagues, in the news media, and on social media. And the third box, all the way on the right of the slide, suggests some specific venues that champions may be able to access to advance your policy agenda. For instance, one of the most impactful ways to educate and advocate is for your champion to hold events, right? So community events would be a really valuable step for working with your champions to organize. Press releases may reach constituents specifically, or perhaps even elevate the issue and milestones related to advancing solutions that are aligned with your advocacy agenda to a national level, really depending on the venue. And you may also have multiple target audiences with these efforts. For instance, rallies, town halls, community events may specifically increase community awareness and thus build more collective capacity and interest in implementing policies that do get passed. And dear colleague letters, briefings, hearings, etc., those may instead target your champion's colleagues to gain momentum and support to increase the chances of getting new policies signed into law. So to go more into detail on a couple of these, just so you know, briefings provide opportunities for legislators and their staff to deepen their knowledge related to your issue and solution. Briefings are typically held by an organization or coalition and sponsored by one or more policymakers, and really intend to gain support to advance a particular policy proposal. And there's often a panel of expert speakers who are tasked with providing a really balanced presentation about the topic under discussion. Dear colleague letters are letters through which policymakers announce and provide support for their policy positions with the intent to rally their colleagues around working together to address a particular issue with a certain policy solution proposed in legislation. And these letters also often have calls to action inviting colleagues to sign on and support as a co-sponsor. And so those are just some examples of how you can partner with champions to advance some common policy goals that you have with them. And these are some supports that you, as an advocate, may consider providing to maintain strong relationships with and supporting your champions. So starting at the bottom in a deep teal color here, we believe it's important to remember that policymakers are the experts of their setting. And so they will often have really the best idea of what's needed and what is not needed to move a particular policy agenda forward, which means asking how you can help will often yield really meaningful roles for advocates to play. For instance, if you ask your champion what you can do to support, they may let you know that they've arranged for 10 of their colleagues with equal composition of Republicans and Democrats to host town hall meetings on a piece of federal legislation, and they might recruit you to tap into your network to help them find speakers in any or all of the cities that their colleagues represent. And in addition to building your relationship and becoming a go-to person with your champions, these types of events often get local and maybe even national media attention. So you have the potential to work in collaboration with policymakers to really increase support that may go beyond the local constituency itself. Another possibility among many is that your champion may ask you to recruit people to testify on behalf of a particular piece of legislation, or even ask you to testify yourself. And this is where you might want to consider that storytelling framework that we would discuss in a different module to really inform how you frame testimony to inspire policymakers to act. And so just a few examples, and moving up this diagram to the next point, in our experience, it's really critical to be reliable and responsive. Even if you can't help with the asks we just mentioned for any reason, responding to any and all requests to speak out about your issue, even if it's to say no or to help them find an alternative, is critical to keeping the relationships with champions healthy. And the more you can say yes, the better. We would invite you to also be proactive in being in touch with your champions, and that may look like sending information again about new research or emerging best practices related to your issue or solution, maybe opportunities for them to speak, and perhaps developments either from the media or even better, straight from the communities that have implemented similar changes. Those updates can be really influential as well. Another type of activity your champion may enlist you for would be to support the creation of materials that they intend to circulate among their own networks, like a one-pager or something similar. And, these are just a few examples of how you can work with champions and their staff to really create meaningful, sustainable relationships that in turn contribute to meaningful, sustainable policy change. And this will help keep you on the forefront of your champions' minds. All of this on this slide is helpful to help you be a go-to person or advocacy group related to this issue and solution, which means you will likely experience more chances to directly participate, and you'll have more power and influence in proposals related to the policy agenda that you and your champion share. And moving up to the next item to consider in orange here, that outreach may involve you and your advocacy network extending your gratitude to publicly and privately thank your champion for dedicating their time, energy, and passion to advancing your policy agenda. Some organizations and coalitions even create awards to give legislators who really go above and beyond and achieve things like contributing mightily to getting a bill signed into law. And this is one of the many places where tracking developments and staying really attuned to champion activity can be helpful. Because let's face it, policymakers are typically used to getting a lot of negative attention, but genuine appreciation for what they're doing right is a bit less common, and uplifting their contributions through that solution-focused lens can really strengthen your relationship. And finally, making mutual connections is another valuable way to support the development of your champions that you've enlisted. And you can connect each other to helpers, right? Whether it's your champion policymaker connecting you with an allied advocacy organization that they've heard from, or vice versa, which may look like you uplifting voices of lived experience by connecting policymakers with those impacted by the issues and solutions that are related to your policy agenda. And that doesn't just have to be bringing folks from your advocacy network in to speak with policymakers and their staff members at their offices. Since you already have relationships with these champions, you may even be able to invite policymakers to visit community-based organizations and different community-based resources that are shining examples of the work that you want to see more of. For example, perhaps gaining support for more statewide initiatives by giving your legislator a tour of a school that has become a model for its trauma-responsive procedures, maybe even inviting families from the school to talk with them about the impacts that such trauma-informed changes have had on their lives. Something like that could be really impactful. Or maybe holding a community roundtable type event to invite champions and their colleagues to. The sky is the limit. Ultimately, these are just a few examples of how you can work with champions and their staff to create meaningful, sustainable relationships that, again, in turn, contribute to meaningful, sustainable policy change. And so to wrap this module up, we just want to emphasize that in our experience, constituents mobilizing to build relationships with their legislators and their staff is one of the most effective ways to reach a wide network of decision makers, to generate education and awareness that has the power to collectively spur action around the topics that we all care about by virtue of being a member of the CTIP network. And there are many, many, many competing issues that those of us who understand the science recognize as falling under the umbrella of a trauma-informed, resilient, and healing-centered future, and a preferred future where institutions and systems are designed, implemented, and evaluated through a trauma-informed lens in alignment with the values and principles that we explore in greater depth in other modules. And so it's an opportunity for you to share that connection with your legislators. And we hope that this module provides you with ideas and inspiration for how to work collaboratively and partner with policymakers to issue a clarion call to broad networks to advance trauma-informed, resilience building, and healing-centered approaches, and ultimately bolstering momentum behind and support for the solutions that we at CTIP propose as being critical to usher in a more resilient, more equitable, and healthier future world for all.